I called 911. The person who answered was not a police officer. Hello? My 8-year-old voice trembled. Is this emergency services? It sure is. The cheerful male voice on the other end of the phone line answered. What's the trouble, young man? I frowned. Young man, weren't they supposed to say 911, what's your emergency? Something seemed wrong, but I brushed it off. I assumed maybe it was his first day, but I never could have guessed the horrifying truth of who I was actually talking to. Either way, there was no time to waste. Something's wrong with my mom. She fell down all of a sudden. I pressed the phone to my ear and leaned back. My mother lay where she'd collapsed just minutes ago. Oh no, that's too bad. Someone will be over right away. Click. I dropped the phone and crept over to my mother. The faint rise and fall of her chest was the only way I even knew she was alive. Wait, I hadn't told the ambulance people our address. How had they not asked me for it? I ran back to the phone and dialed 911 again. 151 Cliffmore Way, 151 Cliffmore Way. I shouted into the receiver, then hung up. I shut my eyes tight. I wanted to scream, to shatter into a million pieces like the glass that had fallen from my mother's grasp just before she collapsed. But all I could do was wait, hold her hand and pray. It felt like an eternity before the doorbell rang. I sprang to my feet but froze when I turned the corner. A short, brown-haired white man was peering through the window with a grin on his face. He rang the bell again, more instantly this time, and I noticed he wore a red nurse's uniform. I let out a sigh of relief. The ambulance people were here. Everything was going to be okay. I yanked the door open. Hello there, young man, the smiling man exclaimed. I read the name Marbus on his name tag, right beside the pens and stethoscope. Where's the unlucky lady? He asked. You mean my mom? I stammered. She's in here. Two expressionless assistants in identical red uniforms rolled a Guernsey to where my mother lay, surrounded by shards of glittering glass. Up, and away. Nurse Marbus rubbed his hands together excitedly while my mother was loaded into the Guernsey and rolled out the door. A jolt of helpless fear shot through me. They were taking my mother away. Mister, can I ride with my mom to the hospital? I asked the smiling man. Hospital? Nurse Marbus wrinkled his forehead, confused. Oh, there's no need for that. We're professionals, you see. As the assistants loaded my mother into the back of the black ambulance, I looked over their shoulders at the sharp and jagged tools hanging from its walls. They weren't like any medical instruments that I'd ever seen. We'll take excellent care of your mother, the smiling man went on, and call as soon as you can see her. Nurse Marbus leapt into the rear compartment. His expressionless assistants climbed into the cab, and the black ambulance began to back out of the driveway. I ran behind it, waving my hands. I wanted to yell at them to stop, but I was just a kid. Who was I to contradict the professionals? I was still standing there 5 minutes later when flashing red and blue lights came skidding around the street corner. The two police officers muttered into their radios and looked worriedly at the scene in front of them. A crying child, a wide-open door. Did you call 911? A blonde policewoman asked. I did, I nodded. But they already came. They took my mom away. The two police officers looked at each other. I'm afraid that's not possible. We received a call from this location, a child shouting an address, and we're the first ones to respond? The words spun around in my head. If they were the first ones here, who had taken my mom? No, I whispered, my heart racing. Then who was... Before I could finish, the policewoman pulled up her radio again. We need an immediate trace on a black ambulance that just left 151 Cliffmore Way. Suspects are potentially dangerous. The other officer crouched down to my level, his eyes searching mine. Can you describe the man who came to your door? He asked. And Nurse Marbus, I murmured, remembering the name tag. He wore a red uniform and he had two assistants. Their van was full of weird tools. The officers' faces turned ashen as they exchanged a fearful glance. Nurse Marbus? The policewoman repeated into her radio, her voice cracking. She began to frantically search her records on a small device, her hands shaking. The male officer continued to speak with me, but his eyes were wide with shock. They worked in panicked coordination, reaching out to other units and checking databases. Finally, the policewoman looked up to her partner, her face white as a sheet. Her voice was trembling as she started talking. The name Marbus belongs to a man who used to work for the city's medical services, but he died in a terrible accident over 20 years ago. The details were horrifying, and it was said that he had been conducting some unlicensed experiments. My heart pounded in my ears as I processed her words. Dead? What's going to happen to my mom? I asked, tears welling in my eyes. I just want her back. We're going to do everything we can to find her, the male officer assured me, but I could see the fear in his eyes. A full year went by since the officer unconfidently muttered those words to me. Exactly 5 full years since my mother went missing. That was when I first received a phone call. I first heard the ringing on my landline and ran over to it to hear a deep male voice. Hello, young man. Everything is going just fine. She sends her love. That was all he said before ending the call. At least that evil man had the decency to check up on me. I told the police, I told my family I did everything I possibly could to somehow locate this number back to my mother. But there was nothing that could be done. The police spent weeks trying to locate where the call came from, but they couldn't. I had to do something myself. Feeling helpless and desperate, I eventually turned to hiring a private investigator, hoping that someone outside the conventional system might have more success. The investigator I hired was a middle-aged man named Leonard, who had a reputation for being able to find people when no one else could. After a few weeks, Leonard finally got back to me with a lead. He had managed to reverse the phone number, pinpointing it to a landline that was located inside a large commercial building on the outskirts of the city. Interestingly, there were no public records indicating any businesses or residences at that address. Knowing the police would be no use, Leonard and I decided to take a trip to the location. It was a cold night, the moon hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds. plunging the world into an eerie darkness. When we arrived at the building, there were no lights visible from outside. The only indication that someone was there was the faint humming of a generator, despite the entire building looking completely abandoned. Behind the building, I noticed a few large waste bins. Out of curiosity, I approached one of them and found a discarded envelope with a logo imprinted on it. The logo read, Lustrum Pharmaceuticals. I showed it to Leonard and he raised an eyebrow. Lustrum Pharmaceuticals went under a long time ago, he murmured. They were rumored to be involved in some shady experimental treatments. The information was enough to finally bring the police back into the fold. We returned to the station and presented everything to the detectives, including the logo and Leonard's findings. They were skeptical at first, but when they realized that the clues pointed towards a defunct company linked to illegal practices, they took it more seriously. I finally had a chance of getting my mother back, or so I thought. If only I'd known the horrible things that nurse did to him. They organized a raid, gathering a SWAT team and other officers to infiltrate the building. I was not allowed to accompany them, but I insisted on waiting outside the police barricade filled with a mixture of hope and dread. I had to beg to go with them. Being a 14-year-old girl, they didn't want me to come too close during the raid so I wouldn't get injured. They eventually let me go with them to watch. Hours dragged by as I waited, Leonard by my side, his experienced eyes watching the operation unfold. Finally, in the early morning, the door of the building burst open and officers began to escort people out. Most were in handcuffs, members of the twisted organization responsible for taking my mother. And then, finally, I saw her. She was frail and weak, her face pale and her eyes filled with a haunted expression, but she was alive. Officers guided her carefully, placing her into an ambulance. A sob caught in my throat and I ran to her, tears streaming down my face. "Mom!" She turned her head and looked at me, her eyes widening with recognition and love. "Who are you?" she whispered.